somewhere before 1914, Europe went off the historical track that was supposed to lead its peoples toward a better future. At the beginning of the 20th century, most Europeans believed they were heading for a kind of high historical plateau, full of a benign progress and more abundant civilization, in which the benefits of modern science and invention would be more widely diffused, and even competitive struggle would work out somehow for the best. Instead, Europeans stumbled in 1914 into disaster. It is not easy to see exactly where Europe went astray, or when the First World War became inevitable, or, because the human mind cannot discern or predict historical inevitability, so overwhelmingly probable that only the most Olympian statesmanship could have avoided, but no such statesmanship appeared, and Europe fell into a deadly, grinding war that consumed much of its wealth, killed millions of its young men, and ultimately weakened or even destroyed much of its power and influence around the world. The Great War of 1914-1918, in short, became one of the decisive events in modern European and global history. Like other such upheavals, the Protestant Reformation, for example, or the French Revolution, this vast clash of opposing forces spread across all the traditional boundaries of Europe, shattering empires and cultural beliefs that had seemed as indestructible as the earlier unity of the Roman Catholic Church or the enduring power of old regime monarchies. 81. The international anarchy. The great political questions in mid-19th century Europe had been settled by force. The German Empire was the strongest and most obvious of the new political structures that had emerged through the use of armed power. But all of the major European states had concluded 703 that large military forces were essential for their national existence. Never had the European states maintained such huge armies in peacetime as at the beginning of the 20th century. 1, 2, or even 3 years of 1241 compulsory military service for all young men became the rule. In 1914, each of the continental great powers had a huge standing army and millions of trained reserves among the civilian population. Few people wanted war. All but a few sensational writers preferred peace in Europe, but many took it for granted that war would come someday. Such expectations probably made some statesmen more willing to unleash their military forces. In any case, the popular assumptions about future wars, as well as the large standing armies, helped to produce the Great War that exploded in 1914. But the war also came from other causes, including the interlocking system of international alliances, Germany's desire for a greater role in world affairs, which challenged Britain's earlier ascendancy and raised nationalist anxieties in France, and the ongoing conflicts in the Balkans. The inevitability of war, rival alliances, Triple Alliance versus Triple Entente. Political diagnosticians, from Richelieu to Metternich, had long thought that an effective union of Germany would revolutionize the relationships of Europe's peoples. After 1870, their anticipations were more than confirmed. Once united, or almost united, the Germans entered upon their industrial revolution. Manufacturing, finance, shipping, and population grew phenomenally. By 1900, for example, Germany produced more steel than France and Britain combined, though in 1865, the French alone had produced more than the Germans. People in Germany felt that they needed and deserved a place in the sun, by which they vaguely meant some kind of acknowledged supremacy like that of the British. Neither the British nor the French, the leaders of modern Europe since the 17th century, could share in such German aspirations. The French nursed the chronic grievance of Alsace and Lorraine, annexed to Germany in 1871. The British saw German salesmen appear in their foreign markets, selling goods often at lower prices, and using what they viewed as ungentlemanly methods. They 1242 saw Germans turn up as colonial rivals in Africa, the Middle East, and the Far East, and they watched other European states gravitate into the Berlin orbit, looking to the mighty German Empire as a friend to advance their interests. A place in the sun. Bismarck, after 1871, feared that another European war might tear his new German Empire to pieces. He therefore followed, until his retirement in 1890, a policy of diplomacy and peace. We have seen him as the honest broker at the Berlin Congress of 1878, helping to adjudicate the Eastern Question, and again offering the facilities of Berlin in 1885 to bring some international order to Europe's imperial interventions in Africa. To isolate France, divert it from Europe, and keep it embroiled with Britain, he looked with satisfaction on French colonial expansion. He took no chances, however. In 1879, he formed a military alliance with Austria-Hungary, to which Italy was added in 1882. Thus was formed the Triple Alliance, which lasted until the First World War. Its terms were, briefly, that if any member became involved in war with two or more powers, its allies should come to its aid by force of arms. To be on the safe side, Bismarck signed a reinsurance treaty with Russia also. Because Russia and Austria were rivals and enemies in the Balkans, Germany needed considerable diplomatic finesse to stay allied to both at the same time. After Bismarck's retirement, his system proved too intricate or too lacking in candor for his successors to manage. The Russo-German agreement lapsed. The French, faced by the Triple Alliance, 704 soon seized the opportunity to form their own alliance with Russia, the Franco-Russian alliance signed in 1894. In its time, this was regarded as politically almost impossible. The French Republic stood for the legacy of the French Revolution and for everything radical, the Russian Empire for everything reactionary and autocratic. But ideology was thrown to the winds. French capital poured into Russia, and the Tsar bared his head to the Marseillaise. The 1243, the Triple Alliance. The continent was thus divided by 1894 into two opposed camps, the German, Austrian, Italian against the Franco-Russian. For a time, it seemed that this rigid division might soften. Germany, France, and Russia cooperated in the Far Eastern crisis of 1895 to stem the expanding power of Japan. All were anti-British at the time of Fashoda and the Boer War. The Kaiser, William II, outlined tempting pictures of a continental league against the global hegemony of England and its empire. Much depended on what the British would do. They had long prided themselves on a splendid isolation, going their own way, disdaining the kind of dependency that alliance with others always brings. European hostility toward Britain during the Fashoda crisis and the Boer War came as a shock. British relations with France and Russia were going badly. Some in England, including Joseph Chamberlain, therefore thought that a better understanding with Germany should be sought as part of a broader strategy to reduce British isolation. Arguments for racial affinities in this race-conscious age made some people in Britain and Germany favor more cooperation, but politically it was hard to cooperate. The Kaiser's Kruger Telegram of 1896, expressing support for the South African Boers in their conflict with Britain, was a studied insult. Then, in 1898, the Germans decided to build a navy. Splendid isolation. A new kind of race now entered the picture, the naval competition between Germany and Great Britain. British sea power for 2 centuries had been all too successful. The American Admiral Mahan, teaching at this time in the American Naval War College and taking his examples largely from British history, argued that sea power had always been the foundation of Britain's greatness, and that in the long run, sea power must always choke off and ruin a power operating on land. Nowhere were Mahan's books read with more interest than in Germany. The German 1244 naval program, mounting rapidly after 1898, became a source of concern to the British, and by 1912, the German Navy was perceived as an aggressive menace to Britain's global interests. The Germans insisted that they must have a navy to protect their colonies, secure their foreign trade, and for the general purposes of their greatness. The British held with equal resolution that England, as a densely populated industrial island, dependent upon imports even for food, must at all costs control the sea in both peace and war. They adhered stubbornly to their traditional policy of maintaining a navy as large as the next two combined. The naval race led both sides to enormous and increasing expenditures. In the British, it produced a sense of profound insecurity, driving them gradually toward new collaborations with Russia and France. Naval race. Slowly and cautiously, the British emerged from their diplomatic isolation. We have noted that in 1902, they formed a military alliance with Japan against their common enemy, Russia. The decisive break, however, came in 1904, from which may be dated the immediate series of crises issuing 10 years later in the First World War. In 1904, the British and French governments agreed to forget their conflict at Fashoda and the accumulated bad feeling of the preceding 25 years. The French recognized the British occupation of Egypt, and the British recognized the French expansion into Morocco. They also agreed to support each other against protests by third parties. There was no 705 specific military alliance. Neither side said what it would do in the event of war. It was only a close understanding, an entente cordiale. The French immediately tried to reconcile their new friend to their ally, Russia. After defeat by Japan, the Russians proved amenable. The British, increasingly uncertain of German aims, proved likewise willing. In 1907, Britain and Russia, the inveterate adversaries, settled their differences in an Anglo-Russian convention. In Persia, the British recognized a northern sphere of Russian influence, while the Russians recognized a British sphere in 1245, the south and east. By 1907, England, France, and Russia were acting together. The older Triple Alliance faced a newer Triple Entente, the latter somewhat the looser because the British refused to make any formal military commitments. Triple Entente. The crises in Morocco and the Balkans. The Germans, who already felt encircled by the alliance of France and Russia, watched with concern as England drifted into the Franco-Russian camp. The Entente Cordiale was barely concluded when the German government decided to test it by seeing how far the British would go in support of France. The French, now enjoying British backing, were taking over more police powers, concessions, and loans in Morocco. In March 1905, Kaiser William II disembarked from a German warship at Tangier, where he made a startling speech in favor of Moroccan independence. To diplomats everywhere, this carefully staged performance was a signal. Germany was attempting to break up the new understanding between France and England. The Germans demanded and obtained an international conference at the Spanish port city of Algeciras, but the conference, which met in 1906, supported the French claims in Morocco, only Austria voting with Germany. Testing the Entente. The German government had thus created an incident and been rebuffed. The British, disturbed by German diplomatic tactics, stood by the French all the more firmly. French and British army and naval officers now began to discuss common plans. The German attempt to break the Entente simply made it more solid. In 1911 came a second Morocco crisis. A German gunboat, the Panther, arrived at Agadir to protect German interests. It soon became apparent that the move was a holdup. 1246, the Germans offered to make no further trouble in Morocco if they could have the French Congo. This crisis also passed, the Germans obtaining some small accessions in Africa, but it increased British hostility to Germany. Meanwhile, a series of crises rocked the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire, now in an advanced state of dissolution, still held a band of territory from Constantinople westward to the Adriatic, see map P 712, which included Bulgarians, Serbs, Albanians, and Macedonians. In the center and west of the peninsula, north of the Turkish belt, was the small, 706 landlocked, independent kingdom of Serbia, adjoined by Bosnia-Herzegovina, which belonged legally to Turkey, but had been occupied and administered by Austria since 1878. Within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, adjoining Bosnia on the north and west, lay Croatia and Slovenia. Crises in the Balkans, 1247 Anglo-German industrial competition, 1898 and 1913. This diagram shows the huge increase in world trade in the years before the First World War, and also the fact that German exports grew in these years more rapidly than British exports. The exports of both countries together multiplied no less than threefold in these 15 years. The increase reflected a small rise in prices, but it was mainly due to a real increase in volume of business. In 1913, total German exports about equaled the British, but German exports to the United States and Russia, 1,248, greatly exceeded the British exports to these countries. Note how the Germans even gained exports in British India, where the liberalism of British trade policy freely admitted competitive goods. In merchant marine, though the Germans doubled their tonnage, the British continued to enjoy an overwhelming lead. 707 Kaiser William II sought to strengthen Germany's international position by undermining the alliance between France and Britain. His visit to Morocco in 1905, as shown in this image of his arrival at Tangiers, exemplified the Kaiser's assertive style of personal diplomacy. But his call for Moroccan independence failed to weaken the French-British Entente. Holton Archive, Holton Royals Collection, Getty Images. Serbs, Bosnians, Croats, and Slovenes all spoke basically the same language, Serbo-Croatian. The main difference being that Serbs and Bosnians wrote with the Eastern or Cyrillic alphabet, while the Croats and Slovenes wrote with the Western or Roman alphabet. The difference reflected deep differences in religion. The Slovenes and Croats had long been Roman Catholic and hence more affiliated with Western Europe. The Serbs and many Bosnians were Eastern Orthodox and so closer to Russia. 1249, and there were also, especially in Bosnia, large numbers of Slavs who were Muslims, converted during the Ottoman domination. With the Slavic revival, which emphasized linguistic identities, many of these peoples came to feel that they were really one people, for which they took the names South Slavs or Yugoslavs. By 1900, radical Slav nationalists within the empire had concluded that the German Austrians and Hungarian Magyars, who controlled the dual monarchy, would never grant them equal status, and that all South Slavs should form an independent state of their own. Concretely, this meant that an element of the Austro-Hungarian Empire's population, namely the Croatian and Slovenian nationalists, wished to get out of the empire and join with Serbia across the border. Serbia became the center of South Slav agitation. Ethnic and religious divisions 708. This brew was brought to a boil in 1908 by two events. First, the Young Turks, whose long agitation against Abdul Hamid has been noted, managed in that year to carry through a revolution. They obliged the Sultan to restore the liberal parliamentary constitution of 1876. They showed, too, that they meant to stop the territorial dissolution of the Ottoman Empire by taking steps to have delegates from Bulgaria and Bosnia sit in the new Ottoman parliament. Second, Russia, its foreign policy in the Far East ruined by the Japanese War, turned actively to the Balkan and Turkish scene. Austria wanted full annexation of Bosnia, the better to discourage the pan-Yugoslav ideas that challenged Austria's influence in the former territories of the Ottoman Empire. The Russian and Austrian foreign ministers, Alexander Isvolsky and Alois von Ehrenthal, came to a secret agreement in 1908. They would call an international conference at which Russia would favor Austrian annexation of Bosnia and Austria would support Russia's long-sought opening of the Bosporus Straits to Russian warships. Austria, without waiting for a conference, proclaimed the annexation of Bosnia without more ado. This infuriated the Serbs, who had marked Bosnia for their 1250 own. Meanwhile, that same year, the Bulgarians and the Cretans broke finally with the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria becoming fully independent, Crete uniting with Greece. Isvolsky was never able to realize the Russian plans for open access to the Bosporus Straits. His partners in the Triple Entente, Britain and France, refused to back him, and the projected international conference was never called. In Russia itself, public opinion knew nothing of Isvolsky's secret deal. The known fact in Russia was that the Serbs, the little Slav brothers of Russia, had their toes rudely stepped on by the Austrian annexation of Bosnia. The First Balkan Crisis. This First Balkan Crisis presently passed. The Russians, weakened by the Japanese War and by the domestic revolutionary turmoil of 1905, accepted the Austrian fait accompli. Austrian influence in the Balkans seemed to be growing, and South Slav nationalism was frustrated and inflamed. In 1911, Italy declared war on Ottoman Turkey, from which it soon conquered Tripoli and the Dodecanese Islands near Turkey's Aegean coast. With the Ottomans thus embarrassed, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Greece joined together to launch their own war against Turkey, hoping to annex certain Balkan territories to which they believed they had a right. The Ottoman army was soon defeated again, but the Bulgarians claimed more of Macedonia than the Serbs would yield. The First Balkan War of 1912 was thus followed in 1913 by a Second Balkan War over control of Albania. An agreement among the main European powers sought to resolve the conflict by creating an independent kingdom in Albania, which blocked Serbian access to the Adriatic Sea and aroused vehement new outcries in both Serbia and Russia. The Russians had again backed down, and Serbian expansionism was again frustrated and inflamed. Two Balkan Wars, 1251. The Third Balkan Crisis proved to be the fatal conflict that dragged all of Europe into the recurring violence in the borderlands of the Austrian and Ottoman empires. The Third Crisis was fatal because two others had gone before it, leaving feelings of exasperation in Austria, desperation in Serbia, and humiliation in Russia. The Sarajevo Crisis and the outbreak of war. On June 28, 1914, a young Bosnian revolutionary, a member of the Serbian secret society called Union or Death, and commonly known as the Black Hand, acting with the knowledge of certain Serbian officials, assassinated the heir to the Habsburg Empire, the Archduke 709 Francis Ferdinand, in the streets of Sarajevo, the Bosnian capital, which the Austrian Empire had annexed in 1908. The world was shocked at this terrorist outrage, and at first sympathized with the protests of the Austrian government. Francis Ferdinand, who would soon have become emperor, was known to favor some kind of transformation of Austria-Hungary, in which a more equal place might be given to the Slavs. But the reformer who makes a system work is the most dangerous of all enemies to the implacable revolutionary, and it is perhaps for this reason that the Archduke was killed by the Black Hand. The assassination at Sarajevo. The Austrian government was determined to end the South Slav separatism that was gnawing its empire to pieces. It decided to crush the independence of Serbia, the nucleus of South Slav agitation, though not to annex it, because most Austrians thought too many Slavs were living within the empire already. The Austrian government consulted the German to see how far it might go with the support of its ally. The Germans, issuing their famous blank check, encouraged the Austrians to be firm. The Austrians, thus reassured of strong German support, dispatched a drastic ultimatum to Serbia, demanding, among other things, 1252, that Austrian officials be permitted to collaborate in investigating and punishing the perpetrators of the assassination. The Serbs counted on Russian support, judging that Russia could not yield in a Balkan crisis for the third time in 6 years without losing its influence in the Balkans altogether. The Russians, in turn, counted on France, and France, terrified at the possibility of being someday caught alone in a war with Germany and determined to keep Russia as an ally at any cost, in effect gave a blank check to Russia. The German blank checks. The Serbs rejected the critical item in the Austrian ultimatum as an infringement on Serbian sovereignty, and Austria thereupon declared war upon Serbia. Russia prepared to defend Serbia and hence to fight Austria. Expecting that Austria would be joined by Germany, Russia rashly mobilized its army on both the German and Austrian frontiers. Because the power that first mobilized had all the advantages of a rapid offensive, the German government demanded an end to the Russian mobilization on its border, and receiving no answer, declared war on Russia on August 1914. Convinced that France would in any case enter the war on the side of Russia, Germany also declared war on France on August 3rd. These German declarations of war would become the basis for later charges that Germany bore complete responsibility or guilt for the huge human and financial costs that all European nations would pay over the next 4 years. The German decisions were posited on a reckless hope that Great Britain might not enter the war at all. England was bound by no formal military alliance. Even the French did not know for certain, as late as August 3rd, whether the British would join them in war. The British clung to scraps of their old proud isolation. They hesitated to make a final choice of sides. And as the Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey repeatedly explained, in England only Parliament could declare war, so the Foreign Office could make no binding promise of war in advance. It has often been said that had the German government known as a positive fact that 1253 England would fight, the war might not have come. Hence, the evasiveness of British policy is made a contributing cause of the war, and the guilt for what followed is expanded to include, at least to some extent, the government of every major European state. In reality, the probability that England would fight was so great that to underestimate it, as the Germans did, was an act of supreme self-deception. The British 710 government was deeply committed to France, especially through naval agreements. But what swept the British public toward the French was the German invasion of Belgium. The German plan to crush France quickly was such that it could succeed only by crossing Belgium. When the Belgians protested, the Germans invaded anyway, violating the Treaty of 1839, which had guaranteed Belgian neutrality. England declared war on Germany on August 4th. English isolation. Archduke Francis Ferdinand of Austria meets here with leaders of the Catholic Church during his visit to Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. Shortly after this meeting, the Archduke, the tall man with a mustache, and his wife were assassinated by a Bosnian terrorist who wanted Bosnia to separate from the Austrian Empire and join 1254 with Serbia to form a larger Slavic state. The ensuing diplomatic crisis quickly spread beyond Austria and Serbia, mobilized all of the nations in the European alliance system, and led to the First World War of 1914 to 1918. Holton Archive, Holton Royals Collection / Getty Images. The mere narration of successive crises does not explain why the chief nations of Europe within a few days became locked in combat over the murder of an imperial personage in the Austrian Empire. Among more obvious general causes, the alliance system and nationalist ideologies should be emphasized. Europe was divided into two armed camps. Every incident tended to become a test of strength between the two. A specific national incident, such as German intervention in Morocco or the assassination of Francis Ferdinand, could not be settled on its own merits, merely by the parties concerned. However, it was dealt with. One of the two camps was deemed to have lost or gained, and hence to have lost or gained influence in other incidents of perhaps greater importance that would arise in 711 the future. The political leaders in each nation believed that they must stand by their allies, whatever the specific issue, and every local conflict or confrontation became connected to wider anxieties about national security. This was because all lived in the fear of war, of some nameless future war in which allies would be necessary. Causes of the First World War. 1255, the Balkans, 1878 and 1914. Austria and Russia had gradually pushed the Ottoman Empire out of Europe since 1699. The Congress of Berlin in 1878 attempted to stabilize the situation by recognizing Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro as independent monarchies, and northern Bulgaria as an autonomous principality within the Ottoman Empire. The ambitions and discontents of these new states, of Greece and of non-Turkish people remaining within the Ottoman Empire, culminated in the Balkan Wars of 1912-1913. Albania then became independent, and Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece became contiguous. Austrian and Russian pressures, meanwhile, continued. In 1908, Austria annexed Bosnia, where the South Slav population, like the Serbs, was hostile to the Austrian annexation. The Germans complained of being encircled by France and Russia. They dreaded the day when they might have to face a war on two fronts. Willing to accept even a European-wide war to break their threatened encirclement by the Entente powers, they were obliged to hold to their one ally, Austria-Hungary, which was in turn able to sell its support at its own price. The French dreaded a coming conflict with Germany, which in 40 years had far surpassed France in population and industrial strength. They were obliged to cling to their ally Russia, which therefore could oblige the French to yield to Russian wishes. As for Russia and Austria, they were both tottering empires. Especially after 1900, the Tsarist regime suffered from endemic revolutionism, and the Habsburg Empire from chronic nationalistic agitation. Authorities in both empires became desperate. Like the Serbs, they had little to lose and were therefore increasingly reckless in their foreign policies. It was Russia that drew France and hence England into war in 1914, and Austria that drew Germany. Seen in this light, the tragedy of 7 and 12-1914 is that the instability and nationalist conflicts in the deteriorating empires and least democratic parts of Europe through the alliance system dragged the more advanced parts automatically into ruin. The German Empire, too, faced an internal crisis. The Social Democrats became the largest party in the Reichstag in 1912. Their sentiments, for the most part, were anti-militarist and anti-war. But the German imperial government recognized no responsibility to a majority 156 in the chamber. Policy was determined by men of the old, unreconstructed upper class, in which army and navy interests, now reinforced by new business interests, were strong. And many moderates and liberals also shared in the ambition to make Germany a world power, the equal of any. And while it is not true that Germany alone started the war, as its enemies in 1914 popularly believed, it must be granted that its policies had for some years been peremptory and obstinate. In a broad sense, the emergence of a consolidated industrial Germany after 1870, making its bid for world power status through new competitions or conflicts with long-established states and empires, was a distant and basic cause of war. The alliance system was only a symptom of deeper trouble. In a word, the world had an international economy, but an anarchic system of competing, sovereign national states. Economically, each European people now required habitual contact with the world as a whole. Each national population was to that extent dependent and insecure. Industrial countries were especially vulnerable, relying as they did on the import of raw materials and food, and on the expanding export of goods, services, or capital in return. There were, however, no global institutions to police or regulate the worldwide system, and each nation sought to take care of its own interests. This international competition for economic and political advantages generated much of the popular support for nationalist political ideologies and much of the drive for imperialism, in which each great power tried to stake out parts of the world system for itself. Both nationalism and the new imperialism intensified the quest for allies and for binding alliances. The alliances, in a world that was in the strict sense anarchic and seemed likely to remain so, were a means by which each nation attempted to bolster its security, to assure that it would not be cut off, conquered, or subjected to another's will, and to obtain some hope of economic